10th of March 1885 was a crucial date for Anton Bruckner. It was the day on which Hermann Levi conducted the triumphant performance of his 7th symphony that fully established his claims to greatness as a composer. At the time, he was already working on his 8th symphony. Elated by his success, Bruckner created a monumental work that significantly exceeds the dimensions of his earlier symphonies.
He started in July 1884 and got it sketched out quite quickly. The gestation period for his other symphonies was considerably longer, especially the first movements. But by his birthday on the 4th of September 1884, he had the first movement of the 8th all mapped out. We know for Bruckner that certain key dates, like his own birthday, St. Cecilia's Day, Christmas and so on, had a major significance. He used them as a yardstick for the progress of whatever he was writing. And it was the same with this symphony.
After 3 years of work, he sent the completed score to Hermann Levi on the 19th of September 1887.
With your consent, I am taking the liberty of sending you the 8th Symphony. May it find favor. My joy at the prospect of a performance under your masterly direction is indescribable.
But the work did not find favor with Levi. He wrote to Bruckner's friend Josef Schalk.
I've been poring over it for days, but I can't relate to the work at all. I find the orchestration impossible, but what worries me more is the similarity with the 7th, the almost schematic form it has.
Though Bruckner was profoundly distressed by this verdict, it doesn't seem to have come as a complete surprise. As so often, adverse criticism prompted him to start revising the work immediately. The revision process took 2 more years, but after the completion of this entirely new version, Levi was still not willing to perform it. The first performance of the work in Vienna had to wait until the 18th of December 1892, 2 years after Bruckner had finished the revised version. Hans Richter's rendering with the Vienna Philharmonic was a resounding success for Bruckner. Hugo Wolf witnessed the event.
This symphony is the creation of a giant, surpassing all the master's other symphonies in its spiritual dimension and awesome grandeur. The success was almost unprecedented. At the end of each movement, a storm of acclaim broke out with elemental force. In short, it was a triumph worthy of a Roman emperor.
The outer movements of Bruckner's symphonies are usually built around 3 distinct groups of themes. The first movement of the 8th is no exception in this respect.
Es gibt ein erstes Thema.
Like all Bruckner's themes, the first subject in the opening movement of the 8th is very expansive. It has a very characteristic rhythm.
Es hat einen sehr charakteristischen Rhythmus, dieses.
The movement is in C minor, but the key is not clearly established straight away. The harmony is complex from the outset with a great deal of chromatic shifting.
Bruckner marks the second subject, broad and expressive. Basically, it's a very, very simple idea. But it has major consequences for the overall design because its rhythmic shape is entirely different. The first theme has this jagged dotted rhythm, but here we have the typical Bruckner rhythm, 2 plus 3. It's just an upward scale, nothing special. Then comes the response. A calm flowing motif.
With the third group of themes, Bruckner reduces the harmonic complexity. The section is in E-flat major, and this becomes clearly apparent. At the same time, Bruckner develops rhythmic features of the preceding themes.
Rhythmically, this is a reminiscence of the first theme. It's an indication that things are going to be tightly interwoven or connected with one another. And we get plenty of that in the development section that comes next.
Bruckner's highly complex approach to composition is clearly demonstrated by the first theme. In the course of the movement, its melody and its rhythm are detached from one another and worked out separately. In the recapitulation, the first theme doesn't reappear in its melodic form, but in the tragic and dramatic climax at the end of the movement, the rhythm underlying it is given to the trumpets and horns. Finally, the progress of the music is reduced to this rhythm alone, before it dies away on a quiet drum roll. Bruckner designated this passage as the Annunciation of Death. It's followed by what he calls self-surrender in the form of a brief coda closing slowly with a variant of the first theme.
The movement is tragic and dramatic. The inclusion of the Annunciation of Death towards the end makes that clear. And he didn't choose the key of C minor without good reason.
Today, Bruckner's importance as a symphonist is undisputed, but during his lifetime he only achieved the renown he deserved after the success of the Seventh Symphony. At the time, Bruckner was 60 years old and best known as a virtuoso organist and university teacher. His biography is unusual. Josef Anton Bruckner was born in Ansfelden in Upper Austria on the 4th of September 1824, the son of a village schoolmaster. The first important stage in his musical career was the collegiate church of St. Florian, where he entered the choir at the age of 13. But young Anton followed in his father's footsteps and trained to be a teacher, so that he could take on an auxiliary teaching post in St. Florian. Though he was the organist of the Church of St. Florian from 1851 and steadily perfected his musical education, he didn't appear to seriously contemplate a musical career. At the age of 30, he took another examination, entitling him to teach at secondary schools. A few months later, a friend persuaded him to apply for the post of organist at the old cathedral in Linz. He was given the post and subsequently abandoned his job as a teacher in favour of a career in music. All his life, Bruckner lacked self-assurance. He continued to seek musical instruction until he was 39.
The remarkable thing is the way he sought very careful musical instruction on his own initiative. Though he lived in Linz, he frequently travelled to Vienna to study counterpoint with the well-known teacher Simon Sechter, and he also insisted on getting a certificate for every course he took.
Bruckner was 41 when he wrote his first symphony. By then, he'd established his reputation as a virtuoso organist. In 1868, he moved to Vienna, initially teaching music theory and organ at the conservatory, and later lecturing on music theory at the university.
In Vienna, he was absolutely determined to get a job at the university. For a teacher's son from the country, without a von in his name, this was as far up the social ladder as he could go.
The symphonies he wrote in Vienna, numbers 2 to 9, were given a very mixed reception. Bruckner died in Vienna on the 11th of October 1896, but his final resting place was beneath the organ in the collegiate church of St. Florian. After revising his 8th symphony, Bruckner explained his intentions to the conductor Felix Weingartner by giving the symphony a program. He described the scherzo as a portrait of the Deutsche Michael, an emblematic national figure standing for courage, valour and sincerity. The main theme of the scherzo is plain and straightforward.
The thematic material is made up of very different components: a horn call, 2 notes preceded by a grace note, then descending string tremolos and a rather unremarkable rising figure in the bass. These are very heterogeneous elements, and the interesting thing is what Bruckner makes of them.
The first Bruckner symphony where the scherzo comes second, not third. Harmonically, it's less difficult to pin down than the first movement. The form is traditional, scherzo, trio, and a repetition of the scherzo.
The main section of the scherzo is in constant motion, while the trio is more like a contemplation, a song-like melody given all the time it needs to develop.
In character and expression, the scherzo harks back to the first movement, while the slow tempo of the trio looks forward to the third movement. Hardly any other composer concentrated so exclusively on the symphony as Bruckner did. Due to his career as a church musician, he only turned his hand to the genre at a relatively late stage. In stylistic terms, Bruckner went his own way, and this isolated him from his contemporaries. His symphonies aspire to the heights of spirituality. Their proportions are monumental. Their time scale is vast. Though initially well disposed towards Bruckner, the influential Viennese music critic Eduard Hanslick had turned into a vitriolic opponent after hearing his Third Symphony.
Established musical opinion in Vienna was mostly against Bruckner at that time. It's no coincidence that after the successful first and second performances of his Seventh Symphony, he wrote to the esteemed committee of the Viennese Philharmonic Society, asking them to refrain from further performances of his works. That says a lot about his status. Bruckner's influence only really made itself felt after his death.
In Bruckner's Eighth, Hanslick detected a nightmarish hangover style. He feared that it might conceivably impose itself in future, a future we therefore do not envy. For Bruckner, the prospect of Hanslick's strictures became so traumatic that he initially tried to stop the first performance of the Eighth from taking place in Vienna. But the great success of the Seventh Symphony had laid the foundations for a better understanding of Bruckner's symphonic style, and the Eighth was able to assert itself, even in the face of Hanslick's polemics. The Adagio is by far the longest movement of the symphony. Bruckner's wide-ranging main theme is reminiscent of his great ideal, Richard Wagner.
First, we just have the accompaniment, a kind of sonic layer of a special kind. It is divided first into three, then into two, so the rhythm is typical Bruckner. But if you look for the source of that rhythm, you'll find it in the great night scene in Tristan, "Descend upon us, night of love." There you have the same kind of hesitant heartbeat rhythm, gradually quickening as it proceeds. The accompaniment in the lower strings is based on this model. What we hear then is a quite simple sighing motif. Then you have a sudden climax from the whole orchestra. And that is almost a literal quote of the first theme of the Seventh Symphony.
Eine Anspielung auf das Hauptthema, auf das erste Thema der Siebten Sinfonie.
The point here, I think, is that the news of Wagner's death coincided with Bruckner's work on the slow movement of the Seventh Symphony. And it prompted Bruckner to make a number of changes. Returning to the slow movement of the Eighth, it's worth recalling that the initial motif of this movement harks back to Tristan. It makes the reminiscence of his memorial for Wagner in the Seventh Symphony quite clear and plausible. The chorale-like nature of the next passage is then a very fitting continuation.
The second theme of the slow movement is given to the cellos, and in melodic terms it's more close-knit than the first. themes contain various brief chorale-like passages, an indication of Bruckner's deeply religious nature.
Even in the first version of this symphony, Bruckner uses harps in the orchestra for the first and only time in his symphonies. I think this is probably connected with fantasies about heaven, the way religious and profane elements are composed and collated. Listen closely to the slow movement and you'll find a distinct liturgical tone in the chorale-like passages.
Bruckner's religious fervour leaves its mark throughout his works. He came from a devout Catholic background. This and his training as a church musician left their imprint on him all his life. He was frequently heard to say that some of his themes were inspirations that came straight from God. Here's a pupil of his, the conductor Franz Schalk, on the subject.
Bruckner's religious faith was unparalleled. His belief in God was so fervent and strong that it verged on the miraculous.
Johannes Brahms, a Protestant, disliked Bruckner's music and wasn't flattering.
He is a poor maniac, driven round the bend by the clerics of St. Florian.
Bruckner even went so far as to dedicate his 9th symphony to God the Father. The 8th bears a dedication to the Austrian Emperor Franz Joseph, for Bruckner the supreme authority on earth. This indicates not only his pride in the 8th Symphony, but also his subservient attitude to authority. The music contains a direct reference to its dedicatee. Bruckner said about the 4th movement,
"Our emperor had received a visit from the Tsar in Olomouc. So the Cossacks ride in the strings, there's military music in the brass and fanfares on the trumpets when the crowned heads meet."
The first section of the 4th movement clearly alludes to the meeting of the 3 emperors in 1884.
You have the hoofbeats of the riders in the chugging rhythms of the strings. You have a monumental hymn-like passage in the brass, normally used when crowned heads make their appearance. And in the trumpets, you have a strident fanfare motif. These are things typically associated with an event of that kind. Then we have a second group of themes in clear contrast to the first. This section is slower, and within that slower tempo, the periods are also broader. Then comes this motif. If I play that on its own, and then give it a different harmonic structure from Bruckner's, that comes straight from church. The atmosphere is religious.
The third section resembles a pilgrim's march and refers back to a parallel section in the first movement.
Und dann wird in diesen Themenkomplex, und damit ist die
This time, religion is present with a vengeance. Bruckner works in a quote from his early motet, Asperges me, and gives it to the woodwind, with a little colouring from the strings.
Ein bisschen Streichern als Farbe dabei einbaut.
Bruckner takes a long time to commit himself to the key of the final movement. After the exposition of the themes, the development section is also marked by harmonic unrest. This refusal to settle in one key underlines the finale character of the movement and its progress towards the ultimate apotheosis brought by the coda. Bruckner uses a special ploy to give additional weight to the arrival of the key he's been working round to. He piles up the main themes of all four movements, one on top of another, in a complex orchestral tutti.
Basically, this is a procedure more familiar in stage works than in symphonic literature. It's like a closing ensemble in an opera that draws all the threads of the action together and resolves them, even if it doesn't actually combine them. We can see this as an attempt to draw symphonic consequences from procedures used in music drama, particularly Wagner's.
Symphonische Konsequenzen zu ziehen.
It's a masterpiece. Its whole design and the way Bruckner sustains it points to the future. It's the model case of a composer actively engaging with tradition. Bruckner writes a four-movement symphony in the traditional mold, but the way he puts his own stamp on that tradition and points the way to the future makes it a very great work indeed.
Ganz großen Werke.